Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. This episode, the original Whodunnit, Constance Kent, the Victorian child slayer. Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Danny, who wrote today's episode. Brilliant way to start my Wednesday. It's so early in the morning. It's my third cup of coffee somehow, and it's only 9:30. And hopefully it'll make me get through this episode, because I don't like child slayers. Although the fact that it's in the Victorian time somehow makes it easier, because it's like everyone who ever knew these people is now dead. Like, for sure. So that's nice, maybe? I don't know. Look, the format of the show, Danny has written it. I'm going to read. God damn it. You see this? Oh, well, podcast listeners don't. This is a great way to start this show. Sure, it's brilliant for my retention. I went on a bouncy castle this weekend with my kids, and I burned myself on it really badly, like a friction burn. And so I got this giant, uncomfortable scab on my elbow. And whenever I put my elbow down on the desk, it really hurts. So, yeah, just that's fun. I mean, almost as fun as Victorian child slayer. Let's go! If you just happen to be at a loose end while cruising the suburb of Strathfield in Sydney, Australia, on February the 6th, 1944, you could have done worse than popping in to the most happening birthday party in town. Well, to be honest, it might not have been the wildest party you'd ever attended in your life. We're talking about the 100th birthday party of retired matron Miss Ruth Emily Kay, which was held at the Loretto Convalescent Home on Albert Road. Sounds like fun. I've been to a 100th birthday party. When I was a kid, my great-grandma turned 100. And some of my earliest memories are going to her 100th birthday party. Yeah, I think it was in like a nursing home, or like, I guess they called them convalescent homes in the past, because she was old, dude. She died like a year later. I think she was 101. Got those good genes. Except for both my grandfathers, who died before I was born. So got those bad and good genes mixed together. Not much chance of strippers or cocaine or dancing bears, but I bet they put on a good spread for the old dear. I hope she enjoyed it anyway, as she died just 2 months later. And it seems that Miss Ruth Emily Kay was held in pretty high regard by everyone who had known her. Originally hailing from England, she settled in Australia at some point in the 1880s, originally training as a nurse before taking up positions at the Coast Hospital and the Parramatta Girls' Industrial School, and later becoming matron of the Maitland Nurses' Home. This is a different time, like matron industrial school. It's like, it sounds so old. The local obituaries were gushing with praise for her selfless and dedicated nursing work conducted over the course of many decades, right up to her retirement at the age of 88. Good Lord, what are you doing working at 88? You Joe Biden or some I mean, he won't be working much longer. Just like yesterday announced that, yesterday? 2 days ago? When was it? Doesn't matter. That he's not running for president anymore, which honestly is good. The way I think about it is like, my dad retired a decade ago, and he's 68, I think. And the idea of him having the most powerful job in the world in like 15 years is absurd to him. And it's absurd to me, because he's already not as sharp as he was 10 years ago when he was working, because he's getting old. And should old people be doing that? And like, I don't know, Trump's also super old, isn't he? Can't we have some young person running the country instead? Like, come on. And by the country, I mean your country. Just American culture is so dominant. Even the UK news, it's just always like, oh, Trump's doing this, Biden's doing that. And you're like, okay. However, nobody ever stepped forward to claim the ashes of Miss Ruth Emily Kay, and the writers of those obituaries could never have known that this beloved and respected character harbored a shocking secret which stretched back no less than 84 years to Victorian England. It was a secret that involved the savage murder of a 3-year-old boy on the grounds of a stately home. A secret which involved a suspect who was originally deemed by many to be too posh to prosecute on the word of a working-class detective. A secret, yes, the good old days, or as long as you were powerful, no one could touch you, much less a peasant detective. A secret which eventually led to a conviction and a death sentence, although doubts were later raised over whether the right suspect was found guilty. A secret which sparked fresh questions in Parliament over whether a priest had any legal right to withhold vital information given to him during a confession protected by God. And it was a secret which heavily influenced the upcoming genre of modern crime fiction in more ways than one, even helping to shape the character of the archetypal fictional detective hero who could be found solving mysteries within the pages of classic novels for the next century and beyond. Let me guess, it's Sherlock Holmes, isn't it, Danny? So let's now flick the yellowing pages all the way back to the 19th century and reopen the perturbing case of the Victorian child slayer to ponder over the cast of potential perpetrators of the original real-life Whodunnit. Wait, did this 100-year-old old biddy back in the day brutally murder someone in England? You know what they say, the good always die young. Ladies and gentlemen, somebody in this video is a murderer, and I would hazard an early guess that it's probably not Simon. As far as you know, Danny. How do you know that I haven't murdered anyone, Danny? Do you know me, Danny? I mean, statistically, it's really unlikely that I've murdered someone. But also, maybe. You never know. Allegedly. Our unhappy household of Kents. Before we tell the full story of Miss Ruth Emily Kay, we must first tell the story of Constance Kent. It's not likely to be very often that I write back-to-back scripts on two entirely different people who share almost identical names, but just in case you're getting a sense of deja vu, I absolutely was, and I'm like, have I read this before? I remember nothing about the birthday party, but something seems familiar, and I guess it's the name. This is most definitely not the same Constance Kent that we've recently uncovered in a Decoding the Unknown video.
It's a very good reason why Ada Constance Kent may have felt reluctant to use her real name in film credits and theatre bills. The name Constance Kent is more frequently associated with...
Spoilers.
That's another channel I do and podcast. Check it out if you want to. The woman we're talking about today was born in Sidmouth, Devon, in 1844, the ninth of 10 children. There's another thing from the past, isn't it? Born to Mary Ann Kent and Samuel Saville Kent, although only half those survived infancy because, you know, the past was the worst. Mary Ann was the daughter of an incredibly wealthy coachmaker, while Samuel started out as a rug manufacturer before later becoming a factory inspector whose job it was to ensure that women and children, factory workers, were not being exploited. Oh, I didn't realize they had that in the past. That's nice. How are we going to get all this stuff made? Oh, let's just exploit children, kind of like companies in the developing world today. I was recently reading that amazing story about a company that I won't name, but they're a giant, super luxury French/Italian manufacturer, and it's like they got in trouble a few years ago for exporting all of their manufacturing to basically Chinese sweatshops, and they were like, oh, well, if we're gonna get in trouble for that, we'll just bring the sweatshops to Italy, and then they can make all their stuff with the, you know, made in Italy logo on it, but they're actually, you know, just basically imported the sweatshop, allegedly. Oh, I didn't name the company, I can talk And then they're like, oh, yes, but there's also some... And it was... So they're making these things for really little. And then they're like, oh, yeah, but there's really expensive materials that go into this 3,000 euro bag. And the Italian authorities were like, bro, we literally have your financial records. There's like 50 euros in each bag, plus some like sweatshop labor. What are you talking about? So, yeah, luxury goods, kind of a ripoff. I mean, not all of them, obviously, because some stuff is really nicely made. But just check that stuff first. You can Google what this company is. Samuel was widely described as a rude, pompous, and deeply arrogant man who often got caught up in long-running feuds with his neighbors, which may partly explain why the family moved around quite a bit when Constance was a child. He was also said to be prone to blowing the majority of the family wealth on expensive crap, which enhanced his social status while leaving his wife Mary Ann with a pitiful allowance on which to raise all the children. Ah, the past. It's like, oh dear, what have you bought? I've bought a wonderful new horse and cart for myself. And what are the children having at dinner? Gruel, my dear, because you keep buying a wonderful horse and cart for yourself. You've got many. Sadly, Mary Ann was apparently becoming mentally frail shortly after the birth of Constance, although the exact diagnosis of her condition varied depending on who was giving it. Some reports have suggested that she was rapidly slipping into outright insanity, whilst others have noted that she was displaying signs of weak-mindedness. Samuel became concerned that his wife no longer had the mental capacity to adequately take care of the children, and he took it upon himself to hire a new governess in the form of 23-year-old Mary Pratt, an assertive, plain-speaking farmer's daughter who would look after Constance and her siblings, whilst Mary Ann would be largely confined to bed for the rest of her life. The past. It's like, oh, you're a little bit mentally ill. Oh, you've got insanity. Just stay in bed and we'll give you some I want to say laudanum, but I don't really know what that is. It just feels like some oldie worldy drug that they maybe gave to people who were insane in the past to make them shut the fuck up. Despite Mary Ann's ill health, she still managed to pop out a 10th and final child. Oh my god, dude. You're like, yes, my insane wife who's, confined to bed. Yes, she got pregnant. Dude. His name was William, and he would go on to form a particularly close bond with his older sister Constance. However, 44-year-old Mary Ann Kent died in 1852 when Constance was just 8 years old and William was just 7. Samuel didn't hang about too long to source a replacement, and he didn't have to look very far either. Would you believe it? He ended up marrying the new young governess, Mary Pratt. Oh my god, what a coincidence. She went on to give birth to 5 more children, one of whom was a son by the name of Francis Saville Kent. The fact that we're choosing to mention Francis by name doesn't bode well for his chances of surviving the next few pages of the script. Unfortunately for Constance and William, they didn't always see eye to eye with their new stepmother, and it seems that their dad, Samuel, began to favour the new children he conceived with Mary Pratt over the older kids from his first marriage. Whilst the new kids were given their own fancy rooms on the same floor of the house as their parents, Constance and William were relegated to the lower floors, usually reserved for the servants. Oh no. It's perhaps no wonder that the pair began to feel a little resentful and apparently develop a few behavioural issues. Yeah, when you pick favourites between your children, it's not going to end very well, is it? They're going to feel like they're going to develop those behavioural issues, aren't they? But Samuel and the former governess didn't have the time or inclination to deal with problem children. They need a governess 2.0, although the governess who became his wife would be like, uh-oh, I've been here before and I was on the other side of the fence. Whilst the later kids were allowed to stay at the luxurious family home, Constance and William were packed off to boarding school in London, where they'd become somebody else's problem for most of the year. Maybe they were better off at boarding school, although I suppose that depends on the school. Viewers of old British films might conclude that there are only 2 types of boarding school in the UK. The type where it's all jolly hockey sticks and old beans simply enjoying a spiffing time, and the one where the kids are routinely beaten for not washing behind their ears. I imagine that the reality is most of them are a combination of both of these things. Like, everyone's having a spiffing time, except for the beatings. I've had a bit of experience with boarding schools, which was closer to the latter description. Me too. I went to a boarding school. I didn't board. I was a day boy. And, I don't know, well, teachers definitely weren't beating students. But, I mean, boarding schools have got pro and cons, right? I always thought, oh man, it's cool. You get to hang out with your friends all the time, but also you don't get to see your parents. And when you're young, I feel like it's kind of important. In a massive miscarriage of justice, which still boils my piss today. Never heard that phrase before, Danny. I was packed off to school for children with behavioural issues, which some might have described as a borstal. Danny, you're in a borstal? I had no idea. Learn something new about you every day. But I was only sent there because I've been caught playing hooky from regular school far too often, whilst all the other kids were there because they'd set fire to their previous school or stabbed their teachers in the eye with a fork. God damn, dude. It was a pretty traumatic time for me. I spent about 6 months trapped in a cycle of constantly breaking out of the place and then getting dragged straight back there by the police. At one point... Daddy, I can't believe you went to a borstal. I wasn't even allowed to wear proper clothes in class, as it was felt that I'd be less inclined to escape if I was only allowed to wear pajama bottoms and slippers throughout the whole day. On the plus side, you got to wear pajamas to school, which has got to be fairly nice. It didn't work. It just meant that I escaped in the middle of the freezing night to embark upon a 10-mile walk dressed only in my pajama bottoms and slippers before inevitably getting picked up by the police again. Thankfully, there was an eventual intervention after somebody realised I was probably going to get found dead in a ditch at some point. I'll cover the story in more detail in my forthcoming autobiography, 40 Years of Wretched Sobbing. Oh, Danny, no! Constance and William may have had better time than I, though, although the thought of attending a Victorian-era boarding school doesn't exactly fill you with much optimism, does it? But they still may have preferred the boarding school life to home life. However, they still had to come back for the Hole's old sport, and when they returned home in the summer of 1860, life would never quite be the same. I love the term old sport. Like calling people old sport. I fucking love that. I gotta do that more often. Like, oh, afternoon, old sport. It's just so quintessentially British. It's awesome. By this time, the Kent family had settled in a sprawling mansion in the village of Rode, which was then considered to be part of the southwest county of Wiltshire, although today it's classed as being part of Somerset. fascinating. The location was a bit confusing even back in the day, as it actually sits right on the boundary. If anyone was to commit a heinous crime in the Kent household, the territorial police forces of Wiltshire and Somerset would initially bicker over whose responsibility it was to deal with it. So, let's hope nothing serious ever happens there. I get the feeling something serious is going to happen there. There were 9 members of the Kent family living in Road House on the night of the 29th of June 1860. A few of the older children from Samuel's first marriage had already flown the nest by this point, so that left Samuel and his second wife Mary, 16-year-old Constance and 15-year-old William, 2 older daughters from Samuel's first marriage and 3 children from his second marriage, including 3-year-old Frances Saville Kent, who slept in the nursery right next to the master bedroom. The other 2 children from the second marriage were absent from the household on account of them not being born yet, although Mary Pratt was now pregnant with the 4th. There were also 3 living members of staff residing in Road Hill House, including the cook, the housemaid, and 22-year-old Elizabeth Goff, who was the nursemaid for the younger children. Hello there, Elizabeth Goff. I can see your future playing out. The nursemaids are all lining up, the governess or whatever it's called. And then she's like, none of these person. Let's choose Elizabeth. She's hideous. The only reason you get hired, Elizabeth, is because you're hideous. Hideous is such a good word. I don't know what's wrong with me today. I'm finding everything funny. It's an episode about someone who kills children. But I'm like, you're hideous, Elizabeth. Hideous! Alas, there was no live-in butler, which is a shame. It has instantly topped my list of suspects for any crime to have taken place on that night. Samuel wasted no time in pissing off his new neighbours. He erected massive new fencing and gates to deter the local oiks from trespassing on his property, which is fair enough, but he also banned any fishing in the little river, which ran near his house, and even I just erected a massive fence between me and my neighbour's house. That's not really true. It's just a nicer looking fence. The fence that was there before was falling down. And we were like, well, we got to replace that, don't we? So we replaced the fence. And now there's not really a fence because they've just put in the columns. This is a fascinating story. Thanks, I appreciate it. And even before the family had properly moved in, it brought a prosecution against a young lad called Abraham Nutt, who had been caught scrumping apples from the orchard. It's believed that Samuel may have been living beyond his means by this time and was struggling to pay the boarding school fees for Constance and William. It was also noted that the notoriously difficult man was a bit of a pain in the arse to work for. During the 4 years the family now spent at Road Hill House, no less than 100 female servants are reported to have come and gone, and it's not clear if all of them were paid everything they were owed. I don't understand how this guy's obviously got generational family wealth, right? I don't understand how that goes away if you're not an idiot. And I guess the fact is that this guy's an idiot, but it's like, yo, you have all this stuff, you have all these properties and investments, just live off the money it makes and your family will be rich forever. And then some dude like this comes along and is like, yeah, bro, or I could spend it on like sick carriages and everything just gets f***ed up. Brilliant. By the early morning of June 30th, the disagreeable employer would have a lot more to worry about than school bills, his incredibly high staff turnover, and bothersome locals poaching trout from his river. A dark discovery at Road Hill House. The nursemaid, Elizabeth Goff, had put young Frances to bed in the nursery by 8 p.m. as usual on the previous night. Samuel Kent was the last to retire to bed at around 11:30 p.m. after bolting and locking all of the windows and doors in the house, which would have been a pretty mammoth task in itself. He really should have had somebody employed to do that kind of thing. Also, just don't leave all the doors open. You live in a massive house with loads of windows. Just leave them shut. Just open the ones you need. As everyone in the Kent residence was presumably sleeping soundly in their beds at around 1 a.m, it's widely reported that their pet Newfoundland dog, which slept in an outside kennel, began to bark quite loudly at some unusual disturbance, but nobody in the house heard it. I was a little dubious about this part of the story at first, and wondered if it was some kind of dramatic scene setter which had been added to the story later. After all, if nobody heard the dog barking, then how are we supposed to know that it barked? Well, there might be some truth in it. Although nobody in the house heard the dog barking, a couple of pesky poachers later admitted to the police that they'd heard the dog making noises whilst they were illegally fishing for trout in Samuel's River under the veil of darkness. However, the Newfoundland was reported to be mildly yelping in excitement rather than barking aggressively. At 5 a.m. the next morning, the nursemaid Elizabeth went into the nursery to attend to 3-year-old Frances Saville Kent, but the nursery was empty. His clothes were neatly turned down at the end of his bed, and the impression of his body was still on the sheets, as if he had been gently lifted up. You might have expected Elizabeth to fly into an immediate panic, but she actually just shrugged and went back to bed for another hour or so. Elizabeth, you got one job, Elizabeth, is to look after the kids and make sure they don't disappear. And they're like, yeah, whatever. I guess kids were like disposable in the past. Jesus Christ. It's like, oh no, half of them died. Oh, brilliant. She's like, he probably died and he just got raptured. There was a good reason for this lack of urgency, though. The child's mother, Mary, often nipped into the nursery in the middle of the night to take Francis next door to the master bedroom. Oh, well, there you go. Assuming this is what happened, Elizabeth grabbed another hour's sleep before rising again at around 6 a.m. and attending to other early morning duties. It wasn't until 7 a.m. that she knocked on the door of the master bedroom to ask Mary if she could attend to the young Mr. Saville. Mary you know you live in a posh house where they call the kids Mr. or Master. Mary responded quizzically that Francis had been in the nursery all night, and after a frantic 30 minutes of searching the house and checking with the other family members and staff, it soon became clear that Francis Saville Kent was missing. Speaking of Master, I just booked a flight the other day, and I was normally I'll fly on, whichever airline is cheapest and easiest. And this time I was flying with BA for whatever reason. Normally it's EasyJet or something. And BA's I put in my family's name, and it's my son's name, Master Whistler. And I'm like, BA, this is so old school. I love it. Do you use Master for young people, for young men in Americans? Elizabeth immediately copped an earful from Mary Kent for leaving it for 2 hours before raising the alarm, which was just a tad unfair if Mary made it a habit of occasionally performing a surprise vanishing act with Francis in the middle of the night. Yes, but Elizabeth is the help, isn't she? We let out all our anger on the help. It's what they're for. But there was little time for incriminations. By 8 a.m., Samuel Kent was driven by carriage to a police station in the town of Trowbridge, where he alerted Superintendent John Foley to the disappearance of his youngest son. Meanwhile, back at home, Mary was left to organise a full search of the house and the immediate surrounding areas, even roping in some of the neighbours and locals with whom Samuel got on so famously. Yeah, but when someone's kid's missing, it's even if I didn't like my neighbours and their kid were missing, I'd be like, yeah, I'm absolutely going to help you look for your kid, because it doesn't matter if I hate you, I'm still going to help you with that because it's kind of important. Some of them may have been tempted by the offer of a £10 reward to the first person to find Francis, which Samuel had made before departing in the carriage. That might sound a bit stingy, but it would be just over £1,000 in today's money. Inflation. Yeah, but he's also rich. If my kid was missing, I'd be like, 10 grand. Just without even thinking about it, 10 grand, 20 grand. It's really important to get the kid back. Although you may be he's just playing in the woods, which is why I wouldn't go crazy. But I feel 10 grand, people will be looking mad, bro. I'd be I will find him. Whereas for 1,000, I think people will be I'm not going to find him by lunchtime. I'm just going to go home and have some tea. The search for Francis Saville Kent was only destined to last for around an hour. There was a couple of village locals who made the discovery, a farmer by the name of Thomas Benger and a shoemaker called William Nutt, who was actually the older brother of Abraham Nutt, the young lad who had faced legal action for scrumping apples before the Kents had even moved into Roadhill House. Their search had led them to a small outside toilet hidden away in shrubbery near the bottom end of the vast gardens. This had previously been reserved for the servants of the residence, but had not been used for quite some time, presumably because the servants were now trusted to do their business indoors. The first thing that the farmer and the shoemaker noticed as they approached the small forgotten building was the small trickles of blood leaking out from underneath the door. They'd be like, bro, do we still get that £10 reward if he's dead? Or does he have to be alive? More blood was found within the interior of the building, but it was only when they lifted the lid of the toilet that the gruesome discovery was made. Bro, how they put him in the toilet? About 2 feet below, a bloodied blanket had been placed on the wooden splashboard, which partially blocked off the long gaping pit underneath the toilet. Jesus, toilets in the past were grim. After reaching down to pick up the blanket, the two men found, to their horror, that the dead body of Francis Saville Kent, still dressed in his nightshirt, had been wrapped inside it. The young victim's throat had been cut so severely that he had nearly been decapitated, whilst knife wounds had been made to his chest and hands, possibly after the child had already died, as the murderer attempted to wedge the body further down the toilet. Dude. As the shoemaker William Nutt later told the police, his throat was cut and blood splashed over his face. He was a little dark about the mouth and eyes, but he looked quite pleasant, and his little eyes were shut. His little head fell off almost. Good lord, that is an image that you're never going to get out of your mind. The The body was carried into the house, where shortly afterwards, the local surgeon, Dr. Parsons, declared that the time of death had been around 3 a.m. After the initial squabbling over which police force was supposed to handle the matter, Superintendent John Foley from the Wiltshire Police Station arrived on the scene and began the initial murder investigation, whilst the country coroner, George Sylvester, was summoned to organise a brisk post-mortem. Press reporters were also quick to descend on the house, much to the annoyance of Samuel Kent, to dig up more information on a case which had intrigued and appalled the general public in equal measure: the grotesque murder of a helpless infant on the grounds of a stately home where crimes of this barbaric nature weren't supposed to happen. Yes, and absolutely Samuel Kent would never do such crimes. He's far too posh. Instantly rule him out. It must be one of the peasants. As the Morning Post reported the following day, quoting, "A crime has just been committed, which for mystery, complication of probabilities and hideous wickedness is without parallel in our criminal records. The security of families and the sacredness of English households demand that this matter should never be allowed to rest till the last shadow in its dark mystery shall have been chased away by the light of unquestionable truth." They had a way with words in the past, didn't they? Samuel Kent felt convinced that the murder had been committed by an outsider, perhaps one of the many enemies he had already managed to accrue during his relatively short period at Roadhill House. That seems a bit harsh, considering some of those supposed enemies had most likely been first on the scene to try and help find the missing boy, albeit on the promise of a £10 reward. Incidentally, it has not been documented if the farmer and the shoemaker ever claimed the money. I mean, they probably tried, but it seems like old what's-his-face is a bit of a stingy person, so maybe they didn't get it. They're like, dude, I wanted him alive and he's dead. You're not getting that £10. Now, f*** off. But the superintendent, John Foley, disagreed with Samuel. There was no sign of any breach of the security gates and no footprints found at the end of the long driveway, which an intruder would have had to navigate to gain access inside the house. Furthermore, it was later established that the housemaid Sarah Cox had spotted that one of the windows in the downstairs drawing room had been opened very slightly from the inside when she was attending to her duties on the morning in question, even though Samuel Kent had locked it the night before. All of this led Superintendent Foley to conclude that someone in Roadhill House was a murderer. This is absolutely, it feels like what all old school crime fiction is based on. There's a murder in a stately home and it was one of the residents. It's like literally a game of Cluedo, isn't it? Of course, it wasn't likely to be any of the posh rich people who lived there, was it? Goddamn right, Danny. Far more likely to be one of the servants. Danny and I, same page. At least that appeared to be the conclusion reached by the coroner, George Sylvester, as he initially insisted during the inquest that only the servants of the house would need to be interviewed. People in the past were fucking wild, dude. He was later persuaded to change his mind, but only to a certain extent. While all of the children living in the house did eventually face questions, nobody dared to officially question either Samuel or Mary Kent. This may partly have been down to the influence of Superintendent Foley, who appeared to show deference to the wealthy couple and was kind of allowing Samuel Kent to dictate every course of action. He was unlikely to risk offending such a well-to-do character by asking him to answer a few questions. God, being rich in the future, like now, pretty good. Being rich in the past, it's just like you're above the fucking law, dude. Unusually, whilst the coroner's inquest initially began at a nearby hall, it was later moved to Roadhill House itself, presumably as this was a bit more convenient for the Kent family, although the official reason was that Roadhill House was a lot more roomy. It's also where the murder probably occurred. During questioning, both Constance and William Kent appeared shocked at the murder of their half-brother. Neither of them had heard anything suspicious in the night, and both of them agreed that everyone in the household had shown nothing but kindness and love to the young victim. The inquest jury eventually returns a not particularly helpful verdict of murder by persons unknown. But Superintendent John Foley was beginning to brew his own ideas over the identity of this persons unknown. Well, good, because that's your job. He reckons that the villain in this real-life country house murder was the young nursemaid, Elizabeth Goff. Of course it was. Immediately go to one of the peasants. I'm not saying the peasants. Sorry, I mean servants. I don't know why. I'm just because it's an ongoing joke. I'm not saying the servants are less likely to be guilty. I'm just saying that everyone should be treated as equally likely. Foley reasons that Elizabeth was the last, and not even equally likely, it's far more likely to be one of the dudes, right? Dudes commit way more murders. Although murders of children may be less, like young babies, because like postpartum depression and stuff is a thing, probably completely unrecognized in the past. Anyway, let's crack on. Foley reasoned that Elizabeth was the last person to see the boy alive. It was considered unlikely that she could have slept through an abduction, and she had waited 2 hours before bothering to raise the alarm. Bro. That she could have slept through an abduction. I don't know. Some people just sleep deep. Like, I sleep through anything. Like, you'll have to shake me awake. I'll just be like, until I'm ready to get up, I am out. Like, I have an alarm clock, because otherwise I'm not waking up. She had also given conflicting police statements, initially declaring that the boy's blanket was still on the bed when she walked into the nursery, but then claiming that the blanket was missing after the victim had been found wrapped up in it. As for the motive, Superintendent Foley believed that Elizabeth Goff had sneaked a male lover into the house in the middle of the night. Some reports have suggested that Foley believed the male lover may even have been Samuel Kent himself, although, he's got a track record, doesn't he? Although it sounds as if the superintendent wouldn't have the balls to make such an accusation directly to Samuel's face, even though he has a track record of f***ing the nursemaids. Samuel Foley, how could he be guilty? He's far too posh and scary. Foley proposed that Francis Samuel Kent had wandered into Elizabeth's bedroom for a glass of milk and caught sight of something that he really shouldn't have seen by eyes so young. The two lovers panicked, as Francis was well known for being a bit of a snitch. How old was he? He's like a few years old. Just manipulate him. He's a child. It's not hard. Just be like, what was that? We were play fighting. And you mustn't tell your mother. Elizabeth herself had revealed in a police interview that he was the kind of boy who liked to tell his mama everything, so they concluded that the most effective course of action would be to slit the boy's throat and dump his body in the outside toilet. Clearly, it was the nursemaid that did it. 10 days after the body of Francis was found, Elizabeth Goff was arrested on suspicion of murder. Rumours quickly began to circulate around the village that she had confessed to the murder and even named Samuel Kent as the mysterious male lover. But that turned out to be complete hogwash, much like the reasoning of Superintendent Foley. As we've already mentioned, Elizabeth had good reason to believe that nothing was amiss when she found that Francis wasn't in the nursery, and she was also perhaps a little fearful of waking up the mistress of the house too early. Incidentally, whilst Mary Kent had given the nursemaid an ear-bashing for not waking her up earlier, she later made it clear that she did not believe for a second that the nursemaid was responsible in any way for the murder. The conflicting statements about the child's blanket don't really seem to make much difference to anything in the grand scheme of things, and Elizabeth later quite reasonably stated that she was utterly flustered by the events and had maybe been mistaken when she originally stated that the blanket was on the bed. Yet, a completely reasonable mistake to make. We don't have perfect memories, and it's 5 a.m. You'd be like, going back to bed. And then you're like, oh yeah, I had to get up at 5. And then, oh yeah, there's the missing kid, and you just wouldn't remember. That's fine. And whilst it was considered unlikely that Elizabeth could have slept through an abduction, both Samuel and Mary Kent also slept through that same abduction from their bedroom right next door to the nursery. As for the story of the secret male lover, this seems to have no foundation whatsoever other than a bit of idle gossip and speculation. Yeah. But also, Samuel, my dude, he's got that track record. There was no reason to believe that Elizabeth had sneaked a lover into the house in the middle of the night, and even if she had, it's a bit of a stretch to assume that she therefore must also be capable of murdering a 3-year-old child. But it was the past. You'd be like, oh, she's done adultery. She could easily murder a child. It's like number of people who've done adultery. I don't know, millions? But number of people who've murdered children? I hope it's not millions. Elizabeth Goff was swiftly released from custody on the grounds that Superintendent Foley had failed to come up with a scrap of evidence to justify her arrest. By now, the press is becoming increasingly vocal in their criticism of how the bumbling police had handled this case so far. And this was before it was revealed just how much of a cock-up they'd made of the whole thing. The Morning Post ran a headline which called for the most experienced of detectives to take up the case, and the call was very much heeded. In mid-July, Superintendent John Foley was told to go back catching poachers and apple scrumpers, whilst a call was made to a certain Detective Inspector Jack Witcher in Whitehall in London, a man with a quite considerable pedigree to say the least, although this particular case would leave his legendary reputation in tatters. Oh no! John, what mistake are you going to make? I thought you'd be the hero. You're like when the FBI gets involved with the local police and they're like, we've solved it. It took all of 5 minutes, local police. Detectives were still considered a strange new breed back in the 1860s. 46-year-old Jack Whittaker had actually been one of the 8 founding members of Scotland Yard's all-new detective branch back in 1842, and he was now considered to be the finest detective in Britain, perhaps even Europe, with a long chain of solved cases under his belt. Awesome. He was often hailed as the Prince of Detectives and had mightily impressed Charles Dickens, who had met Whittaker on several occasions and publicly described him as possessing a reserved and thoughtful air, as if he was engaged in deep arithmetical calculations. The public were quite fascinated by the idea of these new sharp-witted detectives digging up compelling clues in the most obscure of places, and it's been 100 and something years, nearly 200 years, and we still are. But this early fascination was fused with a feeling of unease about how these often rough-and-ready plainclothes officers went about their business with such free rein. In this case, it was considered quite inappropriate in some quarters that the farmer's son, Jack Whittaker, was allowed to go poking around Road Hill House and probing the lives of people of who were a higher class. But if anyone was going to get to the bottom of it all, it was surely going to be the Prince of Detectives, and this guy certainly wasn't going to take any shit from Samuel Kent. Within a matter of days, Detective Inspector Jack Whittaker had found his new prime suspect, 16-year-old Constance Kent. Oh my! The mystery of the missing nightgown. Whittaker had initially reconsidered Elizabeth Goff as a suspect, fueled by more village gossip that her mystery lover had in fact been William Nutt, the shoemaker who allegedly found the body of Frances in the outside toilet with the help of farmer Thomas Benger. However, Whittaker was quick to conclude that there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Elizabeth was involved in any kind of relationship with the man at the time. And everyone who actually knew the nursemaid well revealed that Elizabeth Goff was a highly respectable, kind and good-tempered woman who adored Frances Saville Kent. So, Whittaker turned his attention away from the servants and began delving much deeper into the backstory of the Kent family themselves, something that Superintendent John Foley had been reluctant to do. It seemed odd to Whittaker. The family had moved around quite so much in a relatively short space of time, a point which can be partially explained by Samuel Kent's constant feuding with his neighbours, but it also seems as if they were regularly escaping local gossip to embark upon a new life where nobody knew their history. Oh, Samuel, come on, dude. What are you up to? I think Samuel did the murder. He sounds like a bit of a prick. Whilst it may have seemed quite convenient that after his first wife died, Samuel decided to just hook up with the governess, it's now believed that his relationship with the governess, Miss Pratt, most likely took root long before his first wife, Mary Ann, had died. You don't say! And Mary Ann's parents' slide into insanity may not have been all it was made out to be. Oh no, dude, Samuel, I thought you were a douche, but now you're turning into a mega douche. She was most likely suffering from some kind of serious health ailment, but the idea that she was going mad largely appeals to have been promoted by Samuel Kent. Her official cause of death was obstruction of the bowel, and one of her former housemaids claimed that whilst Mary Ann Kent was certainly unhappy, she was most definitely not insane. Yeah, but it's the past. The man could just be like, oh, my wife is mildly annoying. That mild annoyance is a type of mild insanity which could quickly turn into a type of real insanity, right, doctor? And the doctor would be like, oh, yes, Mr. Samuel, very good, sir. Very good indeed. Let's sign her off and send her to Broadmoor. But whatever health issues Mary Ann was enduring, Samuel appeared to take this as an excuse to effectively banish his first wife to isolation in her own small bedroom, whilst he and the new governess enjoyed luxuries in the master bedroom in a separate wing of the house. Hey, Samuel. Douchey douche. Whenever news of this arrangement leaked out into the current neighborhood, Samuel felt compelled to up sticks and move house in a bid to protect his reputation and his respectable career. Wait, I've totally forgotten what this guy did for a living. I thought he was just a money dude. Constance Kent was possibly troubled by how badly her mother had been treated, and she really didn't care for the new replacement who quickly dominated the entire household after Mary Ann's death. And this situation only became worse when Samuel and his new wife began to shower their later children with all the attention and affection, whilst the only attention that Constance and William ever received was severe punishment from their stepmother for the slightest transgression. In early 1856, 13-year-old Constance had become so hacked off with life at home that she persuaded her 12-year-old brother and only ally William to run away with her to the sea. It's the sort of thing a 13-year-old would come up with. We're going to go live by the sea, Willie. She cut her long hair, changed into boys' clothing, and then headed off with William in the general direction of the port city of Bristol, with dreams of securing work as cabin boys and sailing away to life in another country. They didn't get very far. They only made it about 9 miles before they were picked up by the police. That reminds me, again, of my own boarding school days, but at least Constance and William were wearing more than just pajama bottoms and slippers. The little saga proved to be something of an embarrassment for Samuel Kent. Here was a man whose job it was to safeguard women and children working in factories. Ah, yes, this was his job, I forgot. And yet his 2 own children have fled the miserable conditions of the family home. The 2 runaways spent the night in the police station before they were returned home. During questioning by the police, a whimpering William had apparently been profusely apologetic for his actions as he sobbed into his handkerchief and begged for mercy, whilst Constance appeared to be as cool as a cucumber, expressing no regret whatsoever. Well, it's not like they've committed a crime, they're just being returned home. By her own later admission, she was viewed by the police as the bad boy who had led the other astray. After returning home, it's reported that they were beaten and spent most of the next 2 days locked in the cellar. Holy shit. And this episode may well have been the catalyst for the pair of them getting packed off to boarding school shortly afterwards. Detective Inspector Jack Witcher was particularly intrigued about one specific detail regarding this failed attempt to escape the family home. And that's what Constance chose to do with their old clothes and hair clippings just before they set off on their short-lived adventure. Not wishing to leave behind any clues, she had stashed away the items in her favorite secret hiding place. She shoved the hair clippings down the outside toilet and wedged her dress and petticoats into the tank above, where she believed they would never be found. Dude, hiding stuff in like an open toilet is like, you want that stuff back? I mean, she doesn't, but it's like her favorite hiding place. You generally hide things that you want to access again in the future. Not the best idea, Constance. Now that the outside toilet was no longer used by servants, it was as if Constance regarded the small building as her own private little dwelling where nobody else ever ventured and where secrets could be buried. Interesting choice for a private little dwelling. Witcher uncovered a number of other reasons to make him suspicious of Constance Kent. During a search of her bedroom, he came across a large pile of newspaper articles relating to the case of the alleged murderess Madeline Smith, who in 1857 was strongly suspected but never convicted of murdering her lover by giving him chocolates that she had laced with arsenic. Witcher believed that a teenage girl taking such an interest in the macabre was unnatural, and her own father held similar sentiments as he had started to hide the newspapers from Constance to try and wean her off this obsession with murders. Hello there, friend, listening to a true crime podcast, and I bet it's not the only one you listen to, is it now? Yet his determined daughter had still managed to get a hold of them for a collection. I don't think we could draw too many conclusions from this. It's a little bit like accusing, Danny and I are on the same page, aren't we? Of accusing regular casual criminalist viewers of being potential murderers based purely on their YouTube and podcast habits. I have it on good authority that at least 73% of casual criminalist viewers have hardly ever even murdered anyone. Those 27% you gotta watch out for. But I suppose we have to remember that this was the Victorian era, when teenage girls living in nice houses were largely expected to restrict their hobbies to sewing, baking, and playing the harp. A far more compelling point raised by Witcher was the mystery of the missing nightgown. If Constance had indeed murdered her half-brother in such a messy way, it's reasonable to expect that her own clothing would have been as stained as the walls and floor of outside the toilet. It transpired that Constance owned 3 nightgowns, one of which had gone missing shortly after the murder, and that the housemaid Sarah Cox later recalled an incident that had occurred at around the same time. Sarah had collected Constance's laundry from her bedroom, as usual in the morning, but just before she was preparing to take it all down to the laundress, Mrs. Holly, Constance called her from the top of the stairs. She wanted to check the slip pocket of her nightgown, as she claimed that she might have left her purse in there. The slip pocket was checked and no purse was found, after which there was a slightly awkward moment as Sarah waited hesitantly to put the nightgown back in the laundry and get on with her work. At this point, Constance asked the housemaid to fetch her a glass of water from downstairs, leaving Constance alone with the nightgown for around a minute or two. Sarah then returned with the glass of water and took the laundry, including a nightgown that Sarah was holding, down to Mrs. Holly. But after this encounter, Constance Kent was found to own only 2 nightgowns instead of 3. This is very suspicious. I'm beginning to think that Constance might actually have something to do with this. Jack Witcher strongly suspected that the original nightgown picked up by Sarah Cox was the one Constance was wearing when she murdered Francis and was stained in evidence of her crime. He also believed that when Sarah nipped downstairs for a glass of water, Constance switched the nightgowns and later got rid of the one that was nearly taken to the laundress, leaving her one short. It was the poor laundress, Miss Holly, who copped the blame for losing a nightgown. This did make me wonder how much blood could have been splashed on the nightgown if it was never noticed by Sarah Cox when she picked it up for collection or watched Constance check the slip pocket for a purse. Perhaps it just wasn't very heavily stained at all, in which case Constance may have been better off just hoping that Mrs. Holly wouldn't notice it either. Jack Witcher may have felt frustrated that he never managed to locate the missing nightgown, but he would have felt even more frustrated years later when Superintendent John Foley meekly revealed that his crack team of clowns had discovered a blood-drenched night garment very early on in their own fumbled investigations. This is why detectives became a thing. Because it's like, this guy's just like, he doesn't know what he's doing. There are several different versions of the story of what exactly happened here, and the truth is not entirely clear. The police either found some kind of night garment stashed away in a boiler hole, or they found a nightgown lodged into a chimney. The legend goes that Foley hit upon the idea of leaving the blood-stained evidence exactly where it was, in the hope that the killer would be later caught in the act of trying to retrieve it. However, the plan went pear-shaped when the police officer, who was supposed to be keeping an eye on the garment, either left his post for half an hour or ended up getting accidentally locked in the kitchen. Either way, by the time he returned to his post, the garment had gone walkabout and was never seen again. Now, it's possible that we could be talking about several different night garments here. The murderer may well have been wearing other layers of clothing underneath the main nightgown, but it does seem to be the case that John Foley's investigation uncovered some form of blood-stained night clothing, which was subsequently and quite carelessly lost, a fact which embarrassed Foley so much that he forgot to mention it at all to Detective Inspector Jack Witcher. So it's like, he didn't mention it in the hope that it never comes up. It's like, dude, it's gonna come up. He's a detective. He's doing the same investigation you did, except better. Still, although Jack Witcher was never destined to fully solve the mystery of the missing nightgown, he still felt that he had enough material to compose a 5-page letter to the commissioner at Scotland Yard, outlining all the reasons why he firmly believed that Constance Kent had murdered her own half-brother. He noted that Constance had great strength, both mentally and physically. She apparently enjoyed a bit of bare-knuckle boxing in her spare time, goddamn, and regularly whipped the asses of older male students. And she had a clear motive. After talking at length to her friends and associates at school, Witcher had concluded that Constance Kent was utterly consumed with jealousy for her younger paternal half-siblings and consumed with hatred for her stepmother, which is not unreasonable because they're treating her like shit while the younger kids get all the attention. Of course she's gonna not take kindly to that. And so she decided to exact cruel revenge on her stepmother by taking from her what she appeared to cherish most of all, the life of her youngest child, Frances Saville Kent. Damaged reputations. Constance Kent calmly denied any involvement in the murder when she was questioned by Jack Witcher, but she got a little more emotional when she was arrested on suspicion of murder on July 16th. As she was led away from Road Hill House, she began weeping and loudly protesting her innocence. Constance was placed in custody for 7 days, which was the maximum amount of time that Witcher had been given to dig up more evidence before his suspect faced the local magistrates. But in the meantime, the public mood seemed to have turned very much against the Prince of Detectives, whilst the plight of Constance Kent was viewed in a sympathetic light. He may have previously enjoyed fame and admiration for solving grubby murders and bringing common criminals to justice, but this time, Witcher was seen to have overstepped his boundaries. How dare this working-class detective start throwing accusations around in a quiet country home owned by nice rich people? And how did he have the nerve to suggest that the 16-year-old daughter of a man with a respectable career might be capable of committing anything more serious than forgetting her manners at the family dinner table? He should have stuck to interrogating the servants instead of poking his nose into the affairs of people well above his lowly class. Better still, he should have stayed in London and stuck to catching proper criminals who have never eaten anything more sophisticated than a jar of jellied eels. It was almost as if Witcher's perceived violation of the Kent's family privacy was a more serious offence than the murder of a 3-year-old boy. One barrister later publicly described Jack Witcher as vulgar, greedy, and rapacious in his destruction of a young woman's life. Yeah, and let me guess, that barrister's also, he's a barrister. He's also rich and powerful, so he's like, ooh, I don't like it when the detectives start sniffing around our business. They're only supposed to deal with the paws, old bean. Meanwhile, the Wiltshire and Devies Gazette ran a scathing editorial in August which read, "We do not believe there is a single human being besides Mr. Whitcher who would think it sufficient to detain Constance Kent in custody for a minute. There was no occasion whatever for calling in the assistance of a metropolitan functionary. Our own excellent police have at all times shown themselves entirely competent in their duties." Bro, come on now. The ends of justice would have been much better answered if they had not been interfered with. No, they wouldn't, because they weren't. He didn't solve it. He had a chance, then they brought in the detective. You're just painting this bloody media. Stop it. Let's not forget that this newspaper is referring to the very same excellent police force who were getting accidentally locked in kitchens, losing vital pieces of evidence, and pointing the finger at the nursemaid with practically no logic or evidence to back up their accusations. It's been suggested that the Wiltshire magistrates were of a similar opinion that Constance Kent was far too posh to be prosecuted on the suspicions of a farmer's son. And this was why, after the 7 days were up, to Whitcher's utter despair, the magistrates' hearing concluded with the release of Constance Kent from police custody. That might not be an entirely fair conclusion to reach, though. Samuel Kent was certainly in a position to spend a ton of money on the most expensive barrister in town to defend his daughter's name during the magistrate's hearing. And the barrister, Peter Edlin, was said to have completely dominated proceedings, at one point telling the magistrates, "There was not a tittle of evidence against her, and yet this young lady has been dragged like a common felon to jail. No motive had been established which would induce the prisoner to stain her hands in the blood of the poor child." Wait, we already established the motive, dude. She hates her stepmother and is super jealous of the brother. "A more unjust, a more improper, a more improbable case was never brought before any court of justice in any place." The quote ends. Constance herself had regained her composure for the hearing, calmly declaring that she'd never left her bedroom on the night of the murder and that she knew nothing of how her half-brother had died. Peter Edlin had gathered together a large group of witnesses to testify to Constance's good character, including the nursemaid Elizabeth Goff. You might have expected Elizabeth to feel somewhat relieved that somebody else was in the frame after she'd been falsely accused, but she was still prepared to stand up for Constance, declaring, "During the whole of the time that I have been in Mr. Kent's service, I have never heard Miss Constance say anything unkind towards the little boy that is dead." But of more significance to the outcome was the fact that Jack Whitcher had failed to come up with anything else in way of hard evidence. Yes, it was suspicious that Constance Kent had previously adopted the outside toilet as her own secret hiding place, and it was worrying that one of her nightgowns had mysteriously gone missing immediately after the murder. Whitcher had still hoped to track down a bloodied nightgown during those vital 7 days, and was still unaware at this point that Superintendent John Foley's squad had already let such a garment slip through their fingers. But with lack of any other evidence to back up his suspicions, Whitcher had been kind of banking on breaking the 16-year-old girl during interrogation and getting her to slip up or confess, but that was not to be. On July 27th, the magistrates ruled that there was not enough evidence to bring Constance Kent to trial, and she was released on £200 bail to guarantee her future cooperation should she be called upon again for future questioning. The killer of Frances Saville Kent would officially remain listed as person or persons unknown for quite some time. That didn't do much for the reputation of the country's greatest detective, or indeed Scotland Yard's new detective branch as a whole. Once viewed as the genius case cracker who could even be relied upon to put all the pieces together and solve the most fiendish of puzzles, Jack Whitcher was now widely ridiculed as the incompetent detective who had falsely accused an innocent teenage girl of murder. And whilst the detective branch was once thought to be the home of a new breed of higher brains who'd always dig up the truth from seemingly unfathomable clues, they were now seen as human beings who could actually make mistakes. It's interesting to note that the word clueless first appeared in the dictionary just 2 years later, and this might have been inspired by typical descriptions of detectives like Jack Whitcher, who clearly didn't know what they were meant to be doing. Whitcher would only spend a few more quiet years at Scotland Yard before he took early retirement in 1864 after being diagnosed with this is a real thing, congestion of the brain. His legacy may appear to have been in ruins at the time of his retirement, but his story was far from over. After Jack Whitcher had returned to London to spend the rest of his career on less taxing duties such as chasing rats down drain pipes, the case was briefly put back in the hands of the local constabulary. Really? Those guys? Really? As they were a little unsure of what they should do next, the police just shrugged and arrested the nursemaid, Elizabeth Goff, again in lieu of any better suggestions. She was swiftly released again when it was deduced that nothing had changed since the last time she was arrested without logical reason. Yes, this is why maybe it wasn't the best idea to go back to the local constabulary, was it? Meanwhile, the Kent family did what they usually did whenever there was a spot of bother brewing at home. They moved house. I guess like stamp duty wasn't a thing back in the day. It's that tax you pay when you buy a new house or sell it. When you buy a new house, not when you sell a house, right? When you buy a house, you have to pay like a percentage. And I guess, or maybe it just wasn't for rich people. This time, they moved all the way to a nice new pad in Wrexham in North Wales, but it seems that Constance still wasn't entirely welcome at home, as she was packed off to a posh finishing school in Dinan, France for a couple of years. Jesus Christ. People in the past, it's like, no, be done with you, child. Go off to another country for 2 years. However, by 1864, 20-year-old Constance was back in England again, although the rest of her family stayed put in Wales, perhaps a sign that Samuel Kent had finally discovered how to go about your life without pissing off your neighbours every 5 minutes. Sam, you're rich, mate. Just buy an estate. Just go buy somewhere where there are no neighbours. Because it sounds like, if you move house and you don't like your neighbours, fine. Maybe it's their problem. But if you move house like 5 times and you don't like all of your neighbours, maybe it's you, Sam. Maybe it's you. Constance trained as a nurse and boarded at an institution in Brighton called St Mary's Home for Female Penitents. Again, the past. Founded by the Reverend Arthur Wagner just a couple of years earlier, the original brief of the institution was to cater for, quote, the rehabilitation of prostitutes and unmarried mothers. Ah yes, prostitutes and unmarried mothers, the bane of society. They must be rehabilitated immediately. And as the place was run by Reverend Wagner and a bunch of nuns, the patients were no doubt gently guided into the teachings of Jesus, who would save the souls of these sinning sex workers and single mothers and reserve them a place in heaven. Brilliant. Constance settled into the place very nicely and helped out the nuns with their work. Her conduct was later described by Wagner as uniformly good. And it seems that Constance herself may have experienced some kind of deep religious awakening during the time she spent hanging around with the reverends and nuns, and she was suddenly overcome by the urge to confess her past sins. Oh my, Constance, are you going to admit to this murder? Oh It's not like she was a sex worker or, perish the thought, an unmarried mother, but she had something that she very much wanted to get off of her chest. The murderer. Oh God, Constance, no. Don't confess your crimes. If you have some religious awakening, don't confess your crimes. Add that to the expanding list of rules for criminals. One report suggests that Constance was actually seeking to undergo confirmation, but Reverend Wagner had a few doubts about allowing her to push ahead with this, as he still had a few concerns about her past, prompting a series of interviews with Constance in which he attempted to ascertain if she was a suitable candidate for confirmation. But whatever the circumstances that led up to the startling moment, it was in 1864, 4 years after the murder of her half-brother, that Constance Kent revealed her darkest confession to Reverend Arthur Wagner. She had been responsible for the murder of Frances Saville Kent. I told you, I had suspicions about Constance, didn't I? Confessions of a Nurse. On April the 25th, 1865. Wait, is Constance our woman in Australia who's 100 in like the 1950s? On April the 25th, 1865, a statement, handwritten by Constance Kent, was read out to a magistrate's court in Bow Street in London. I, Constance Mill Kent, alone and unaided on the night of the 29th of June, 1860, murdered at Roadhill House, Wiltshire, one Frances Saville Kent. Before the deed, none knew of my intention, nor after of my guilt. No one assisted me in my crime, nor in my evasion of discovery. Constance was accompanied in the magistrate's court by Reverend Arthur Wagner, who had convinced the now 21-year-old to confess to the crime so that she could be given the opportunity to finally atone for her sins. We're not sure how exactly these negotiations went. Perhaps she was initially a little resistant to the idea of potentially facing the hangman's noose, or perhaps she was quickly persuaded by the trusted Reverend to do the right thing under the watchful eye of our God Almighty. Look, Don't. He's not really watching. He doesn't know. You think he's got eyes everywhere? You think he's even real? But it's worth noting that a period of around 18 months had elapsed between the original private confession and her arrival in London, and a lot of preparation seemed to have gone into all of this. Whilst the statement was composed in Constance's handwriting, it seems likely that she had considerable legal help in putting together such a formally worded document, and it wasn't just something she quickly knocked together herself en route in the carriage. During her appearance at the magistrate's court, Constance Kent revealed her version of exactly what had happened on that night. I mean, the fact that we're only about a little over halfway through today's video implies to me that there's something else going on here, because otherwise it would just be like, and that's the end of the story. Also, what about our centenarian Australian? It was clear that she had planned the murder for at least a little while beforehand, as she had stolen one of her father's razors, which she had kept hidden in her bedroom for several days. On the night of the 29th of June 1860, she waited until everyone else in Road Hill House had fallen asleep and tiptoed into the nursery. She wrapped Francis in a blanket and took him downstairs, where she climbed out of the drawing room window and made her way to the outside toilet with a candle in the slip of her nightgown. Another chilling sign of the premeditation involved was the fact that Constance had also stolen a box of matches and stashed them somewhere in the outside toilet so that she could light her candle when she arrived with Francis in the hidden darkness of the outside toilet. She began to stab at the child's throat with a razor, but in her own words, she was feeling as if the blood would never come. So she then thrust the razor into the child's side and pushed him down the toilet. Jesus Christ. After climbing back alone through the drawing room window, she realized that she had a few spots of blood on her nightgown, which she attempted to wash out, but later discovered that the stains were still slightly visible. So, over the next few days, she moved the nightgown around various secret locations before she finally got an opportunity to burn it in her bedroom. That's going to be smelly. Inside. According to Constance, this bloodied nightgown never made it into a laundry basket, so the incident with the housemaid Sarah Cox doesn't appear to be connected to the nightgown's disappearance, and it was not the same garment that she wore on that night. But whilst the hiding place was never revealed, it does sound as if Superintendent John Foley's team did indeed stumble across the original bloodied nightgown, but subsequently lost it after Constance returned to move it to another secret location. This crucial evidence was destroyed long before Inspector Jack Witcher even arrived on the scene. Yeah, poor Jack. I feel like Jack's getting short shrift in it. He got short shrift from the public on this. He seems quite smart and good. His brain wasn't congested at all, in my opinion. When the nursemaid, Elizabeth Goff, had first been arrested on suspicion of murder, Constance claimed that she had already made up her mind to immediately confess if Elizabeth was wrongly convicted. And she also reckoned that she'd decided to take her own life if she herself was convicted of murder. Constance Kent emphasized that she had acted entirely alone, but what she never really revealed is why she did it. Oh my god, I'm just putting together the fact that this was the 1850s or 1860s. The reason she's in Australia is they wanted to not give her the death penalty and they exiled her. They sent her to Australia with all the convicts. That's what she did. And she was a nurse, right? Yes! Oh my! They sent her to Australia! Oh, I get it. Everyone at home is probably like, duh, Simon, we figured this out like 7 pages ago. But I get it now. We could have figured this out way earlier. As soon as we found she was training as a nurse, that's when I should have realized this. Maybe some of you at home did. Constance Kent emphasized that she had acted entirely alone, but what she never really revealed is why she did it. Well, she was jealous and didn't like her stepmom, no? And whilst it's generally believed that she committed the act out of jealousy or revenge, she did make a point of stressing that it was for neither of those reasons. Okay. She told the magistrate's court that she bore no hatred to any other member of the Kent family, particularly not her little half-brother, and that her father and stepmother had shown nothing but the utmost kindness towards her. The only clue we got from Constance regarding what possessed her to carry out such an atrocious act is that she had fallen under the influence of the devil, a character who has historically proved quite difficult to prosecute. Reverend Arthur Wagner also spoke in the magistrate's hearing, although he seemed more interested in calling the shots over what he wasn't prepared to say. In a statement prepared beforehand, Reverend Wagner declared, "All the communication which I have had with Miss Kent has been of the most strictly confidential kind and under the seal of confession. I shall therefore feel it is my duty as a clergyman of the church to decline answering any questions which may have any tendency to criminate Miss Kent or to divulge anything which has been communicated to me under the seal of secrecy at confession." The magistrate's chairman gently reminded the reverends that he had just sworn an oath before God to divulge the whole truth in the inquiry, but Reverend Wagner was having none of this, claiming that his duty to God forbade him from breaching the seal of sacramental confession. Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated issue, but I generally feel like if someone's not in immediate danger, this shouldn't be broken. Like, if you confess your crimes to like a lawyer or a priest or a doctor for whatever reason, and you have that expectation of privacy and secrecy, then I don't think it should be broken unless it's like, oh, I'm going to go out this afternoon and murder Peter. In that case, it'd be like, yo, police, he just said he's going to murder Peter. I'm not going to tell you anything else, but go check on Peter, okay? Maybe check on Peter. Make sure Peter's safe. I found it a bit weird that shortly after, Wagner announced he would decline answering any questions which may have a tendency to criminate Constance Kent, he revealed that Constance Kent had confessed to him that she had murdered Francis Saville Kent, which I would have considered a fair bit incriminating. But this also brings us to the thorny and quite muddled issue of the clergy penitent privilege, in which a member of the clergy of some religious faith has the supposed legal right to refuse to divulge any evidence in court which was disclosed to them during a confidential confession shared only between the clergy, the penitents, and the higher authority of God. Yeah, I think this is the weakest one. I think the lawyer and the doctor one is much more important because, you need to have a good defense from your lawyer. Everyone's entitled to a good defense. And like, if you've got a health issue that is somehow related to crimes that you've done, you are entitled to have your health issues fixed. And for that reason, there needs to be privilege with the doctor. Many jurisdictions around the world have their own take on this. Every state in the US recognizes in some form that at least certain discussions between the clergy and church members are protected by privileged communication laws, with Florida taking it to the extreme by regarding a pastor's confessional privilege as an absolute right. The Vatican recently reiterated their view that no Catholic priest should ever be forced to reveal what they learned in confession by any government or law, although countries such as Ireland and Australia are directly challenging this on the grounds that the clergy penitent privilege could potentially be used to cover up cases of child abuse. In the Catholic Church? What? Meanwhile, here in England, the law has always been about as clear as any random passage from the Book of Revelation. Several 19th century trials demonstrated conflicting views of the law, with some priests being found in contempt of court for refusing to divulge information given to them under the seal of confession, whilst in other cases the judges have actually refused to allow testimony from clergymen who were prepared to speak up. Even today, the status of the clergy penitent privilege in England is officially considered to be not absolutely determined, although it's generally believed that it probably doesn't apply in English law. You'd think we'd have sorted this out one way or the other by now, but the argument still rages over whether this is a matter of religious freedom in which individuals should be allowed to seek spiritual guidance and support from the clergy without fear of consequences, or whether this is a matter of priests having the option to protect criminals who may have committed the most vile of crimes. It's often suggested that this particular case was a watershed moment in defining that the clergy penitent privilege does not officially exist in England. That may seem a bit odd, as the unswerving Reverend Wagner was only very briefly reminded by the magistrate's chairman that he had taken an oath to tell the whole truth before the matter was quietly dropped. And it's not like it had any real bearing on the case either way, as Constance Kent intended to plead guilty and wasn't contesting anything said by the Reverend. It may have been an entirely different kettle of communion wafers if the Reverend was withholding information from a confession made by a defendant who was now pleading their innocence. But that wasn't the case here, and the Reverend's second-hand testimony may have been largely viewed as irrelevant, as the magistrates were getting all of the details straight from the horse's mouth. The importance of this case in relation to the law is more to do with the questions it later raised in the House of Parliament and the House of Lords by representatives who voiced growing public concern that Reverend Wagner had effectively been allowed to get away with refusing to give evidence. The response from both the Home Secretary John Gray and the Lord Chancellor Richard Bethell was that Reverend Wagner had no official confessional privilege under English law and that sufficient evidence had already been provided in this case by Constance Kent. In fact, the Lord Chancellor suggested that an order for the contempt of court may have been made against Reverend Wagner, but nobody could be bothered to pursue it. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, by doing that, they're not saying it's right either way. They're just kind of saying, we're not changing the law. And yeah, you're in contempt of court, but by not choosing to prosecute it, they get away with saying, like, you can go free, but not changing the precedent. Yet over 160 years later, we're still not entirely clear if the clergy penitent privilege exists in England, and much of it may boil down to the judge's discretion. So let that be a lesson to you. Like, if you're thinking, oh God, I got to confess to someone, don't do it to a priest. So if you're a religious English criminal who ideally wishes, Danny and I, same page, to avoid a prison sentence if at all possible, it's probably not a good idea to go blabbing to Father Lovejoy. It's not as if he's going to tell you anything useful anyway, is it? Constance Kent was held in custody until her trial on July the 21st, 1865, presided over by Mr. Justice Wills. The trial itself was a short and snappy affair lasting less than half an hour in total. Well, yeah, she's pleading guilty, right? The presence of Reverend Wagner was not required as Constance had already entered a plea of guilty, and she herself did not speak during the brief proceedings. Constance Kent was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She's going to be sent to Australia though, isn't she? We know this. The press reaction to the sentence was a little divided. Harper's Weekly magazine seemed to be of the opinion that Constance Kent deserved everything she got, as they gave their own blunt overview of what she did. With an iron will, and iron nerves, and an iron wrist, she lifted her own brother from the happy sleep of innocence and almost hacked his head off. I mean, she's guilty of a terrible, terrible crime, but she was also a child, or a teenager when it happened, right? I don't think we should be executing teenagers. Or people who were teenagers when they did crimes, especially if they confessed to them later. However, other quarters of the press, and indeed the public, were lobbying for leniency, which might seem a tad surprising from the perspective of the modern world in which a typical reaction to an appalling crime would run along the lines of the rope's too good for them. Yet in this case, there was a strong feeling that the penalty was a bit harsh and that the young woman did not deserve to die for something she did at the age of just 16. Yeah, I feel like we'd have the same reaction today. I don't think people are more like the rope's too good for them today, are they? I feel like that was more the case in the past. Maybe that's just me. One person who, of course, had every right to feel vindicated after this turn of events was our good old friend, Detective Superintendent Jack Witcher, who it turns out hadn't been quite so clueless after all. What a surprise, the competent guy was competent. Witcher had taken his early retirement due to ill health just a year earlier, but he lived to see his suspect convicted of the crime that he was utterly convinced she committed, and he may well have felt compelled to blow fresh raspberries at all those wretched plague sores who had ever dared doubt his great intellect and judgment. Although Witcher himself would only live until the year 1881, his legacy would live on far longer in the shape of the modern fictional British detective that unwittingly he helped to create. Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 short story Murders in Rue Morgue is widely regarded as the first modern detective story, but the 1868 novel The Moonstone, written by Wilkie Collins just 3 years after the conviction of Constance Kent, is widely regarded as one of the most influential modern detective novels, which practically became a template for the whole genre. Long before the creation of the world's most famous literary detectives, such as Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple, and the Hardy Boys, Wilkie Collins introduced us to the character of Detective Sergeant Cuff, who is entirely based on Detective Inspector Jack Witcher. In fact, The Moonstone borrows heavily from the case of Constance Kent in general, featuring a crime committed in an English country house, a botched initial investigation by blundering local constabulary, a missing piece of incriminating nightwear, a false accusation made against the wrong suspect, and a clever detective called in from London to solve a closed house mystery in which anyone in the building could be guilty, even one of the posh folk. It was essentially the first whodunit novel, which laid down many of the tropes that would frequently resurface in modern detective novels over the next 150 years, and it was heavily inspired by the real-life murder mystery at Road Hill House and the real-life detective who solved the puzzle. Isn't that nice? It wasn't just Willie Collins who drew inspiration from the idea of a slightly crumbled, lower-class outsider detective summoned from far away to barge into a cozy setting, sift through the clues, expose red herrings, and get to the bottom of a bewildering mystery. Jack Witcher pretty much became the blueprint for the modern detective, inspiring the creation of Charles Dickens's Inspector Bucket, Colin Dexter's Inspector Morse, R.D. Wingfield's Jack Frost, and countless others. But probably not Sherlock Holmes, on account of Jack Witcher not wearing a deerstalker's hat or frequently injecting himself with cocaine. Yeah, he didn't have those two awesome things. Now, that's all very well, but there were still some who believed that the suspicions of Mr. Witcher may not have been entirely correct, and that a young innocent woman had been sentenced to death on the strength of a false confession. There'd always been a little doubt over why Constance took a total of 5 years to bring a confession to court, amid speculation that she might have been covering up for the real killer. There were also concerns that some parts of her confession may not have entirely added up. Constance had claimed that the only weapon she'd used on the victim was a razor, and yet Francis had been found with knife wounds on his chest and hands. Oh, I assumed that they were just mistaken about that. Okay. While she claimed that she had later stabbed Francis in the chest with the razor after believing that the blood would never come from slitting his throat, a strange observation to make when the victim's neck had been cut so badly that he was almost decapitated, I'd imagine it's quite difficult to actually stab somebody with a razor. So, was there another weapon involved? And why did she not reveal this? Was the knife used by somebody else? Constance claimed that her nightgown had merely a few spots of blood on it when she returned to the house, but again, bearing in mind the horrifying severity of her half-brother's wounds, you would probably have expected her nightgown to be absolutely drenched in the stuff. And how did a 16-year-old girl manage to burn the nightgown in her bedroom without anybody noticing a fire? Yeah, burning even like a piece of paper inside is going to be real smelly. Come to think of it, what did she do with the razor and the candle and the box of matches? You might assume that she'd have stashed those in the same secret hiding place where she hid everything else, but nothing of this nature was ever found. While some parts of the confession do seem to raise at least one or two questions, we equally have to ponder why Constance Kent would have chosen to face death by hanging to cover for somebody else's crime, and who else could possibly have been the real killer. Local village gossip still seemed to suggest that the nursemaid, Elizabeth Goff, was responsible, and there were still some mutterings that the shoemaker, William Nutt, only knew where to find the body because he was the one who put it there, perhaps as an act of revenge against Samuel Kent for prosecuting William's younger brother over apple scrumping. That seems to me like a bit of a disproportionate response. Yeah, no is that you prosecuted my brother, so I murdered your child. But there are psychos. People are psychos, don't forget. In fact, they're both pretty absurd suggestions with absolutely zero evidence to support them, and I'd think it unlikely that Constance would have been willing to sacrifice her own young life to protect the nursemaid or the local shoemaker who murdered her half-brother. Yeah, it seems very unlikely. I think she did this. I just think that she confessed later because she became religious. Perhaps she'd be more inclined to sacrifice her life for a member of her own family. Even after Constance had confessed, Charles Dickens revealed that he believed Samuel Kent had something to do with it. There are even rumours that Samuel may have had a bit of form in murdering his own family, and that he'd been slowly poisoning his first wife, Mary Ann, to leave him free to get jiggy with the governess, Mary Pratt. When the poisoning eventually led to Mary Ann's death from obstruction of the bowel, Samuel continued to perpetrate the myth that his late wife had gone insane. It's not clear why he would have felt the need to murder his 3-year-old son, although theories continue to pursue the ideas of him having an affair with Elizabeth Goff, which Francis observed for himself after wandering into her bedroom at a bad moment. I don't know why everyone keeps picking up on the nursemaid, but Charles Dickens felt that this scenario was the most likely for some reason. A couple of other slightly suspicious... Really, Charles? I think the most likely thing is that the woman it's the woman who confessed. A couple of other slightly suspicious points relate to the behaviour of Samuel Kent after it became clear that his son was missing from the nursery. He took off in the carriage to alert Superintendent John Foley at the police station in the town of Trowbridge, but this wasn't the nearest police station to Road Hill House. It seems like an odd decision to take the longer scenic route when you're reporting a missing child, and this may have been a perfect opportunity to dispose of a certain bit of incriminating evidence, such as the knife. But there wasn't a great deal of difference in the distance between police stations, and Samuel Kent may have had previous dealings with Foley, which led him to conclude that Foley is the chap to trust in an emergency. Another curious point is that Samuel told the police that the missing Francis was definitely wrapped in a blanket, a fact which wasn't known until the later grim discovery in the outside toilet, and a fact which Elizabeth Goff had mistakenly contradicted when she originally recalled that the blanket was still on the bed in the nursery. Perhaps Samuel Kent knew more than he was letting on, or perhaps he was just making an assumption over the already confusing point of whether or not his son might have been wrapped in a blanket. But regardless of the assumptions of Charles Dickens, another suspect who is widely regarded as a more likely candidate is Constance's 15-year-old brother, William. It seems improbable that William would have acted alone, but the theory goes that he may have been the secret accomplice of Constance Kent, and his involvement was never discovered. I mean, yeah, also, maybe someone did it with her, but she still did it. The siblings shared a particularly close bond following the death of their mother, and it is often felt as if Constance and William were against the world as they raged against the injustice of a household now dominated by the former governess and her new children. Constance was clearly the older sister, whom William followed without question. As we know from earlier failed attempts to run away to the sea, Constance was seen as a bad influence who led the younger sibling astray. But she was also fiercely protective of William, So, could she have manipulated the weaker William into participating in the murder, but later did everything she could to keep her beloved brother out of trouble and out of the hangman's noose? Yeah, absolutely. In her best-selling 2008 book, The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, later adapted into a series of TV movies starring the brilliant Paddy Considine as the title character, the author Kate Summerscale puts forward the argument that William Kent may have been an accomplice. She speculates that Constance was trying to save William's inheritance as well as his life. At the time of her confession, 20-year-old William would have been just 1 year away from inheriting his share of his mother's considerable fortune, and a death sentence would have put the dampers on that just a little bit. It's possible that Constance also couldn't bear the thought of William's rightful inheritance from their mother getting diverted into the hands of her father's new family with Mary Pratt. So, could William have been responsible for the knife wounds that Constance Kent claimed were made by a razor during her confession? We'll return to that thought in a moment or five, but none of this was going to be of much help to Constance Kent back in 1865 as she faced the death sentence for the unassisted murder of Frances Saville Kent after making a confession which appeared to completely exonerate any other member of the family. However, Constance Kent was ultimately spared the rope. Yeah, because she's going to Australia. The Kents Down Under. It's widely reported that this was down to personal intervention of no higher authority than Queen Victoria herself, but that appears to be complete twaddle. It was the Home Secretary, John Grey, who swiftly took the decision to commute the sentence to 20 years in prison. Another widely reported falsehood is that the Home Secretary was bowing to pressure from the public and the media to show leniency to the young women, but in fact it was more down to a technicality. John Grey stated that Constance Kent could not be served with the death penalty. She'd only been a 16-year-old child when she committed the murder. Yeah, good, fair enough. Constance Kent would spend the next 20 years moving around various English prisons, and during this time it's reported that she worked on a number of church mosaics as part of her penance, which are still very much on display today, including, most notably, a piece on show in the crypt at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. We're not really in a position to give a comprehensive assessment of her artistic skills, though, as it's impossible to tell which bits she worked on during the group endeavour undertaken alongside a large bunch of other female prisoners. We're not even really sure if she made a contribution at all. But one thing we can be certain of is that Constance Kent kind of evolved into a work of art herself during her long stint behind bars. Okay. On the strength of her short-lived reputation as one of the most famous women in England, she was deemed worthy of having her own waxwork model on display at the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds in London. Over the years, the Chamber of Horrors has been home to waxwork likenesses of Vlad the Impaler, Genghis Khan, and Adolf Hitler, so you clearly have to earn your spot in there. And it's not for everyone. Whilst there were calls for the waxwork models of Jimmy Savile and Gary Glitter to be moved into the Chamber of Horrors after the pair somewhat fell from grace, this was eventually deemed a bit tasteless, and the figures were instead destroyed. Jesus Christ, I think that's for the best. Let's just destroy them. It's believed that Constance received very few visits in prison from her family, if any at all. Her stepmother died at the age of just 46, just 1 year after Constance was imprisoned, whilst her father Samuel remained in Wales for the rest of his life and died in 1872 at the age of 70. Prison records show that Constance regularly wrote to her brother William and pleaded with him to visit, but it seems unlikely that he ever did. He only ever wrote 2 letters to his sister over the course of her 20-year prison sentence. Oh my, that's especially bad if she basically shut the up about you also being a part of the murder, which we don't know if that's true or not, but, if it is, that's real bad. William hadn't done too badly for himself at all in later life. After working as a government advisor on fisheries, he ended up emigrating to Australia and becoming a coral photographer, acclaimed marine biologist, and published author. Okay, dude, your life turned out all right. His 1893 book, The Great Barrier Reef for Australia, was considered one of the most detailed observations of Australia's reef system ever undertaken, although not that many readers could afford to enjoy their own copy, as the mighty leather-bound volume cost the equivalent of 2 weeks' pay for the average worker. As for Constance Kent, 6 unsuccessful petitions were made for her early release from 1878 onwards until she was eventually released from prison on April 16, 1885, having served her full 20-year sentence. So I really thought she would just be exiled to Australia, sent to a prison camp or whatever immediately, but it seemed, okay, she had a 20-year sentence. Yet for the best part of a century, nobody really knew what happened to her after that. The British media would occasionally look back on the Victorian child slayer, speculating that she might have formed a new identity overseas, but nobody really knew for sure, as the name Constance Kent just completely dropped off the radar. It wasn't until 1929 that a letter from Sydney, addressed to a UK publisher, appeared to shed more light on the fate of Constance Kent. The previous year had seen the publication of a book written under the name John Rode, actually a pseudonym for crime fiction novelist Cecil Street, entitled The Case of Constance Kent. The book took one of the first detailed dives into the murder of Frances Saville Kent, but the composer of this letter from Sydney took strong exception to certain parts of it, which prompted a 3,000-word admonishment to the publisher. The writer of the letter had apparently been a close friend of Constance Kent toward the end of her days and claimed that her friend had forged a new life after her release from prison. The conclusion of the letter reads, "After her release, she changed her name and went overseas and single-handedly fought her way to a good position and made a home for herself where she was well-liked and respected before she died." But earlier portions of the letter took issue with Cecil Street's claim in the book that Constance's mother, Mary Ann, had been insane, a point which the letter claims is completely untrue. In fact, it goes on to suggest that Mary Ann died from syphilis, which she contracted from her adulterous husband, who then ducked responsibility, claiming that the mother of his children had just randomly gone mad. Wait, he had syphilis back in the day? Would he have really lived to 70? Syphilis wrecks your brain. There was no treatment back then. I mean, there was. Couldn't they do malaria therapy, where they give people malaria to heat them up real hot, and maybe that'll kill the virus? Bacteria? Virus? Syphilis? Syphilis virus, right? While this seems to contradict the official cause of death listed as obstruction of the bowel, it's not out of the question that syphilis could have led to such an obstruction, although this would be considered incredibly rare. The anonymous writer of the letter also goes into detail as to how badly Constance and William were treated by their stepmother and how they were frequently beaten and locked in cupboards, eventually pushing Constance to the point where she sought to plot her dreadful retribution. However, the really intriguing point about this letter is not so much about the content, but the identity of the author. Although the letter claimed that Constance Kent was now dead, Cecil Street suspected very early on that it was actually written by Constance Kent herself. And much later in the 1979 book, Cruelly Murdered, the British author Bernard Taylor points out that the likelihood of Constance being the real composer of the letter, as so many of the details mirror the genuine later life of the convicted murderer, which had only recently been uncovered. If Constance really did write that letter, it's interesting how she broke her silence to make the point that her mother was not insane. And it's perhaps even more interesting how she seems to have little regard for her adulterous father and suggests that she was driven to murder by the actions of her wicked stepmother, a far cry from her original confession in which she stated that her father and stepmother were always kind and that she had fallen under the influence of the devil. Whilst it does seem likely that Constance penned the letter herself, it can't be certain, as the original handwritten document was donated to the Detection Club Library of Crime Fiction and History, but was sadly lost during the Second World War. What we do know for sure is that Constance Kent was very much alive at the time the letter was posted in 1929. However, I suppose it could be argued that there was a grain of truth in the letter's suggestion that Constance Kent was dead, as the name had long since been buried. She was now known as Miss Ruth Emily Kay, a highly respected matron of the Maitland Nurses' Home in Australia who was looking forward to her retirement and maybe even a cracking 100th birthday party in the not-so-distant future. Constance Kent had sailed to Australia in 1886, less than a year after her release from prison. It's often assumed that she was following in the footsteps of her brother William, who had emigrated to Australia around the same time to piss about underwater. And it's even been suggested that William facilitated the entire trip and invited his sister to stay with his new family. But there's no evidence of such a family reunion, and it seems more likely that Constance arrived in Australia entirely alone. After changing her name to Ruth Kay, she worked as a volunteer in typhoid tents during the epidemic of 1890 before training as a nurse in the Alfred Hospital in Prahran, Melbourne, Victoria. She later settled in Sydney, where she was appointed as sister in charge of the female lazaret at the Coast Hospital in Little Bay in 1894, where she spent most of her time caring for women with leprosy. From 1898, she spent the next decade working as a matron of the Parramatta Girls' Industrial School in New South Wales, which was effectively a lock hospital. I guess that's a sort of detention hospital for troubled juveniles who receive regular lectures from Ruth Kay on the perils of sexual delinquency. Another very old school phrase right there. It was toward the end of this period that she heard the news that her brother William had died in October 1908 after returning to England. It's believed that she had little or no contact with William since her release from prison, and she did not attend the funeral held not too far from Road Hill House. According to the obituary in Nature magazine, William Kent would perhaps be best remembered by his sumptuous work on the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. There was no mention in any printed obituary of his connection with the Victorian child slayer or the murder that had taken place in his old family home in 1860. Ruth Kay would go on to take up the position of matron of the Pierce Memorial Nurse Home for retired nurses in East Maitland, where she would stay right up until her own retirement in 1932 at the age of 88, after which she moved into the Loretto Convalescent Home in Strathfield in Sydney. Wow, it feels like a long time ago that we were talking about that at the start of the video. During her final years, she had reached out to one of her nieces and asked her to visit. Olive Bailey was the daughter of one of Constance's half-sisters, Mary, and was then based in Australia. Olive's mother had been 5 years old at the time of the murder and had never disclosed the details of Frances Saville Kent's death to her daughter other than vague references to a family tragedy. Oddly enough, Olive wasn't even aware that Ruth Kay was her aunt when she first agreed to pay her a visit at the retirement home. Ruth had simply told her that she had been a good friend of her recently deceased mother and would love the opportunity to meet. Olive went on to pay several visits to Ruth Kay and even got an invite to that 100th birthday bash. She later recalled that Ruth was a really wonderful little old lady and was quite jolly. Everybody seemed very fond of her. It's gotta be weird finding out later that she actually murdered one of your family members. It was on one of the very last visits that Ruth Kay not only revealed her real identity to Olive Bailey, but also revealed that she was responsible for the murder of Frances Saville Kent. Olive had never given her reaction to this bombshell revelation, nor provided any details of what exactly was said. It may well have been a retread of the original confession that Constance Kent had given to the magistrate's court in 1865, or perhaps there were some new details that Ruth Kay now felt compelled to divulge to a family member. It was most likely the first time in nearly 60 years that Ruth Kay had talked to another living soul about her past identity, and perhaps sensing that her own time was very nearly up, it could have been the case that she wanted to ensure that at least one other person knew the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Ruth Kay, formerly Constance Kent, died on April the 10th, 1944, just a couple of months after her 100th birthday, which, let's not forget, is 97 more years than her victim was ever allowed to enjoy. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, they could always die young. It might seem a bit strange, and more than a little alarming, that someone with Constance Kent's history was allowed to spend much of her career working with vulnerable children. It has to be said that Ruth Kay was widely viewed as an excellent and highly skilled nurse and administrator who always displayed nothing but kindness to those in her care. But it would seem that nobody in Australia was ever remotely aware of Ruth Kay's dark past. Aside from her confession to Olive Bailey, it was a secret that she hid from everyone ever since she first landed in Australia and forged a new identity in 1888. But could it be that Constance Kent held on to other secrets that were never shared with anyone over the course of 84 years? And were we ever told the whole truth about the murder of Frances Saville Kent? Okay, Danny, I really feel like we're wrapped up today's episode, but okay. The missing final page. While it's often suggested that Constance Kent may have been taking the rap for the real killer, I think there are a couple of suspects that we can rule out straight away. Let's not even point the finger at the nursemaid Elizabeth Goff again, as her name was dragged through the mud more than enough times during the original investigation, based on little more than salacious village gossip. As for Samuel Kent, whilst it does sound like he was a greasy little tweasel, indeed, who treated his first wife, Mary Ann, very badly, lied about her medical condition, and neglected Constance and William after marrying the former governess, there's nothing to suggest that he would have any incentive to murder his own 3-year-old son. In fact, any idea of Constance Kent being completely innocent and covering up for somebody else doesn't really make any sense at all. Why would she risk the threat of a death sentence or life imprisonment 5 years after the event, when the case had been dropped and there was nobody else in the frame to protect? Perhaps the real question is whether or not Constance Kent acted entirely alone. Yeah, but we're never going to know. That's why I feel it's wrapped up. Yeah, maybe the brother was involved, maybe not. Literally impossible to find out. And if she did have an accomplice, then the obvious suspect is her brother, William Kent. It might seem a bit unfair to cast aspersions on an acclaimed coral photographer, marine biologist, and author, other than to point out that his books were far too expensive. And there's never been a shred of evidence uncovered which would directly link William Kent with the crime. But there remain several troubling points concerning the confession of Constance Kent, which suggest that she may not have been telling the entire story. Aside from her curious account of almost decapitating a child without getting much blood on herself, despite the fact that the outside toilet was seeping with blood, the most puzzling part of her confession was her account of using a razor to stab the victim and creating wounds that the coroner said were made by a knife. If somebody else was wielding the knife, that is mysteriously missing from Constance's confession. It's not too surprising that suspicions point to her devoted younger brother and confidant and close ally and only true friend William Kent, who were sharing identical experiences of neglect and cruelty in the new household setup. We already know that Constance Kent was fiercely protective of William, but if she was trying her best to protect him during a confession, you do wonder why she just didn't claim to have used the knife herself. I can only speculate, as she was by then a deeply religious young woman who had just sworn an oath under Almighty God to tell the truth. She might have considered this to be a whopper too far. So, she limited the confession to her exact role in the murder without making reference to any actions that may have been made by an accomplice. I was also struck by another troubling point, which goes back to the role of Reverend Arthur Wagner in all of this, and the whole controversy surrounding the clergy penitent privilege. Reverend Wagner made a point of declaring to the magistrates' court that he would not divulge anything which had been communicated to him under the seal of sacramental confession. This appeared to provoke little more than a defeated shrug from the magistrate's chairman, and it didn't seem hugely important as Constance Kent was already providing a full confession. He was happy enough to reveal that Constance Kent had confessed to the murder of Francis Saville Kent, so what else was there to be said that may have required protection from the clergy penitent privilege? Well, maybe that she wasn't telling the whole truth, but we won't ever know. And why was there an 18-month gap between Constance Kent's private confession to Reverend Wagner and her public confession in London? It may have been that the private confession revealed way more details than the public confession, and after 18 months of discussion in which Wagner may have tried to encourage Constance Kent to divulge the whole truth, he eventually reluctantly agreed to publicly discuss only her role in the murder, whilst considering any knowledge she had of a potential accomplice to be off-limits and protected by God. In that sense, the clergy penitent privilege may have had more bearing on this case than we previously imagined. Considering their close bond, it does seem quite possible that William at least knew more than he ever let on about a murder which was fueled by the same family jealousy and hatred that he shared with his sister. Whatever his involvement may or may not have been, it seems almost certain that Constance Kent would have been the ringleader who thoroughly deserved her 20 years in prison, perhaps even got off a little bit lightly. If William Kent was involved on any level, he would most likely have been coerced into following his sister's ghastly plan, just as he had been persuaded to run away to sea with her a couple of years earlier, before later expressing tearful and frightful regret to the police, while Constance showed no flicker of remorse. We naturally have to assume William Kent's complete innocence in view of the lack of incriminating evidence, and if his sister had indeed covered up his role in the murder, you'd think he might have later expressed some gratitude instead of just ignoring her for the rest of his life. Yeah, it's a bit of a dickish move if he did. But we're still left with the unanswered question of how those knife wounds were inflicted on Francis Saville Kent. Unlike a typical example of modern crime fiction, the case that so heavily influenced the genre still leaves us with a couple of dangling plot threads that will never be fully resolved. Yeah, because real life isn't clean and tidy like fiction. One last point to bear in mind is that even Detective Inspector Jack Witcher strongly suspected that Constance Kent did not act alone, but he had no proof to back up his suspicions. His feelings weren't made public at the time and only came to light fairly recently during a perusal of his confidential reports held on file by the Metropolitan Police. The suspicions of Mr. Witcher have a reputation for being bang on the money. But whilst it took 5 years to see his suspicions on Constance Kent proven correct, I doubt that any vindication of his other suspicions over what exactly happened at Roadhill House in 1860 will ever make it to the final chapter of the original Whodunnit. Yeah, it's never going to be solved. It's just one of those things we have to be okay with. Anyway, this has been an episode of Casual Criminalist, long one at that. Thanks for being here, appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.